Welcome to the Environmental Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Grady, and our mission is to bring you interviews with leaders in the environmental industry with the goal of providing you information about industry trends, climate change, future energy, circular economy, regulatory topics, and service providers making an impact in the business. And today's guest is Taryn McKnight. She is the PFAS Practice Leader for Eurofins. And so, Taryn, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
Well, good. Hey, before we jump in, can you tell us a little bit about what you do so the listeners kind of know who you are and how you ended up becoming the PFAS practice leader for Eurofins?
Okay, well, hi everyone. So my name's Taryn, and I started out in the industry about 18 years ago. And for the first half of my career was actually specializing in vapor intrusion, which at the time was an emerging pathway of concern. And the second half of my career has been focused on PFAS, which are emerging contaminants of concern. So
Man,
always in that emerging space.
You've just been in the thick of it. I mean, I remember we were doing, vapor intrusion, over 10, 12, 15 years ago. It was like the first thing that was leading the industry in the new exposure pathway that needed to be assessed. So
That's right.
Yeah, and here you are doing the next exposure assessment type stuff with PFAS. That's great. Well, okay, so for those who may not be familiar with Eurofins, what type of services do you guys offer?
So Eurofins is a global network of laboratories. We are in the pharmaceutical space, product testing, food testing, and environmental testing. And so in the US, I'm part of the environmental division. And we have laboratories across the country that range from what we consider full service labs. So they do every type of environmental testing and matrix and methods. And then we have very specialized laboratories that might do specialty metals speciation or asbestos or PFAS.
Okay. All right. Well, let's do this. So you guys have a lot of different laboratories in the U.S. How many different ones do you have? I mean, like how many locations do you have?
So we have full service laboratories and we have service centers. And I think all total something around 90 locations around the country.
Wow. Okay. So you guys are spread out pretty well.
Yeah.
Like there's no reason not to use you. You're somewhere around the corner.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
All right. That sounds great. Well, all right, let's do this. Let's talk a little bit about PFAS. And before we kind of like let the listeners know why it's so important, maybe let's tell them what PFAS is, because some of the listeners probably like, hey, I know all this. I'm a very technical, informed environmental professional, but there's probably going to be a few people that listen in that aren't very informed about PFAS and what it is. So let's cover that real quick before we get into the other details.
Sure. So PFAS is an acronym. It stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is a mouthful. What it means is
that's why we abbreviate it.
Yes. Many people are probably familiar with hydrocarbons. These have driven, environmental assessments and cleanups for decades. So it's basically a hydrocarbon that's been fluorinated. So we replace the hydrogen bonds with fluorine. And that bond between a fluorine and a carbon is very strong, and it makes these chemicals persistent and resistant to any type of degradation, and therein lies the rub. So we're dealing with these complex chemicals. There's thousands of them in this class. We're really just scratching the surface on which of these chemicals are in our environment and our commerce, what the health effects are of these different chemicals, and so that's what makes them emerging.
Gotcha. So in other words, they're like forever chemicals.
Yeah, they have been coined forever chemicals. That's right.
They don't break down very well, do they?
There's no known degradation pathway in the environment. So how long they last is really unknown right now.
Now, there is some destruction or some treatment capabilities, right?
There are, right. Just not a known natural environmental. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Okay, well, that's good to know. I mean, that's good for the listeners to know. Okay, so let's talk about why PFAS is so important and understand the health concerns involved with the exposure.
Yeah, so although these are called emerging contaminants of concern, they've been around for decades. And it was really two specific chemicals that have been studied the most, PFOA and PFOS. And they're what we call legacy chemicals
Mm-hmm.
that were produced for mass quantities for decades. And most of the toxicology is based off of just those two chemicals. They've been associated with a number of negative health outcomes. They're classified as possibly carcinogenic. Some of those negative health outcomes include thyroid disease, ulcerative colitis, high cholesterol, impaired immune response, which is gaining a lot of attention in our current climate, reproductive issues, and this is just for those two chemicals. So the EPA is doing quite a bit of work right now to try and develop toxicological profiles for a broader list of PFAS chemicals and understanding how the different ones affect us differently.
Okay. All right. And are these chemicals, I mean, like, where would you find these chemicals in normal, day-to-day life?
Unfortunately, they're just about everywhere you turn. So they're in all of our bodies for the most part. So the CDC does testing, and about 99% of people in the US test positive, have these chemicals in their body. They're considered to be ubiquitous. But where they come from is there's plenty of industrial sources, but they're in a lot of our consumer products. They're in our food packaging materials. You think about anything in your life that is a stain resistant, water repellent, non-stick, all of those properties typically come from PFAS chemicals.
So, like our Teflon cooking,
Right. The
cooking.
Teflon pans were kind of made famous for having PFOA. That's what Teflon is, and your outdoor gear, your waterproof jackets and
Your
boots,
Gore-Tex gear.
right? That kind of
Yeah.
stuff. All of
Wow.
your fast food, the wrappers that your hamburgers come in, the pizza boxes to keep them from sticking, those are coated with fluorinated chemicals. So lots of sources.
So they're everywhere, and we're currently exposed to them like crazy, right? I mean, it's not like, they're everywhere.
Right.
And it seems like there is a lot of, these health risk concerns down to some very low levels. Do we really know that the exposure to these chemicals is worse than it is, or I mean, is it really attributable? Because we're talking really low levels for some of these PFAS chemicals. So maybe you could shed some light on that, because it seems like you guys are trying to really detect levels of PFAS at some very small level.
Yeah. So the levels you're talking about right now are part per trillion. In the single digit part per trillion are the levels that we're testing for PFAS at. And the health advisory limits that have been established by the EPA, right now they're in the 70 parts per trillion range. So
Okay.
70 and less. Different states have taken different approaches. It all kind of comes down to your interpretation of the toxicological studies that have been done and what is considered a safe limit of these chemicals in your body. But again, it's compound specific. So it's which PFAS compound. And there's a big movement out there right now to regulate PFAS as a whole class, that we shouldn't treat them individually, we should treat them as one whole class, and that all PFAS compounds should be regulated the same.
Well, do they have like a accumulation effect,
They do.
bioaccumulation effect, where like, one class, another class adds up, and, like if you had 30% or 30, you know, trillion of one and 30 of another, now that means I got 60, or
That
is it just,
they do,
individually?
yeah, exactly. It is cumulative. They do, and they do bioaccumulate, but they have different half lives, for example. So
Oh, okay.
how long they stay in your body? One chemical could stay in your body for 9 years. Another chemical could eliminate from your body within 48 hours. So
Mm.
they really have a wide range of properties which are going to impact the toxicological effects of them.
Well, let's talk about the regulatory status of PFAS in the country. It seems like there's various states and federal agencies that are taking steps to regulate PFAS. So, what are some of the states, and is the EPA going to start enacting policies in the near future or with legislation?
So, a lot of what the federal EPA has done to date has been voluntary or guidance.
Okay.
And they're just really starting to transition into more of a regulatory mode. So enacting legislation is actually driving them to enact regulation. And so there's a number of different regulatory actions in play right now. There's regulating these chemicals in drinking water.
All
So under
right.
the Safe Drinking Water Act,
Okay.
those motions, those steps are in motion right now. There's also a push to designate these as hazardous substances,
Mm.
which would, comes with it a bunch of its own kind of implications.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's some regulation around reporting for these chemicals that are being emitted from industry. So if industry emits any of these certain chemicals to the water, land, or air, they have to be reported on.
Yeah,
So
they just got added to the toxic release inventory (TRI) reporting requirements this year, right?
that's right. Unfortunately, there's a little disconnect between Congress and EPA on that effort. So Congress is the ones that enacted that legislation that requires it, and they identified 172 PFAS compounds that are reportable. Unfortunately, laboratories can only test for about 14 of those 172 PFAS chemicals.
Oops, a little
Yeah,
disconnect there, huh?
yeah. So some work can be done on self-reporting what the industries know they're utilizing in their
Yeah,
processes. But when you get to a point for anybody who, like for landfills, for example, if they would have no idea what's coming to them and they need to be able to test for those chemicals, their hands are kind of tied. So we've got
sure.
some progress to make on that front.
Okay, well, that makes sense. It sounds like there's a lot of gaps still left to be filled there.
Yeah.
And then you talked about the drinking water. With so the MCL, the maximum contaminant level, right? I mean, that's the drinking water level that is potentially predicted as being safe for human consumption. What's the proposed level for MCL? Do you know, or have they talked about it yet?
So we don't have a proposed limit yet. Right now, they're just in the very early stages of deciding that making a determination to regulate these in drinking water is warranted. So they made that decision, and now they begin a very long rulemaking process. So I actually just heard an update from the EPA this morning that they're targeting March of 2023 to release their proposal for regulating PFOA and PFOS in drinking water.
Okay.
And it'll be released for public comment. And then they hope within 18 months of that date to publish a final rule.
So 2025, early 2025, they'll be trying to enact legislation that says now you have to meet these limits. It's going to put a lot of requirements around the drinking water industry and treatment. I'm assuming it's going to have to beef
Right,
up the treatment capabilities.
right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the waste, now the hazardous substance scenario is also a very intriguing scenario, and I think a lot of concern for, uh, I guess, quote unquote generators or users of material. I mean, I think that's a big wild card as well, right? I mean, the implications there are pretty important.
Yeah, so we were told by the EPA for several years now that a hazardous substance designation was basically imminent, and we never saw it come. Now, under the new administration, President Biden has specifically called out this action item as part of his plan to address PFAS. So we really are expecting that designation to come now. But with it, there's all sorts of far-reaching implications. So a big one is recovering cost from the Department of Defense to clean up PFAS associated with military installations. These are not
Mm-hmm.
regulated as CERCLA hazardous substances, and therefore the states can't recover costs from the Department of Defense to clean them up. So that's probably the first biggest implication. The next
Right.
is these would be required to be listed on SDSs, on safety data sheets, as being contained in those products. And these would be hazardous substances that now you would need to address under a phase one in a due diligence property transaction
Well,
effort.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So lots of
Lots of
implications,
yeah,
and yeah.
yeah, potential liabilities and concerns for addressing and maybe remediating sites that have levels that aren't at are they going to come up with are they thinking to list it as a potential hazardous waste?
So, I'm that's not my area of specialty, kind of
Haven't heard
what
on
the
that.
difference will be between hazardous waste versus hazardous substance
Sure.
designation.
Okay. Well, I mean, either way, it's going to be a challenge. I'm assuming so, or I'm sure it will be. So,
Yeah.
let's get into you know, in order to support regulatory health-based screening levels, what limits of detection do laboratories need to really achieve to get down to the level that you need to say, "Hey, it's here"?
Yeah, so I mentioned the EPA has this health advisory limit for drinking water of 70 parts per trillion, but the states have really moved away from that, and the
Okay.
limits keep going lower and lower.
Oh, really?
So right now, you've got states with limits that are awfully close to what laboratories can detect, and some states are even below what most laboratories can detect. So the regulation will keep pushing industry to improve upon technology and processes, and be able to support those lower limits. So right now we are approaching sub part per trillion range. So that means we are entering the parts per quadrillion range for
Mm,
PFAS now.
mm. Well, what are some of the states that are driving, the levels lower and lower that are really out in front of this, even out in front of the EPA?
So the Minnesota has the lowest limits, and California is, let's say, hot on their heels. And other than that, you've got some states that are in that range. So they're in the single digit to 10 or 20 part per trillion range. That includes Michigan, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts. So a lot of the states that have been dealing with PFAS for a lot longer.
Gotcha, gotcha. So a lot of the Northeast states and some of the West Coast, California comes to mind as a. They like to lead with their state regulations in addition to
They
whatever
do. I'm sure they'll
EPA.
surpass Minnesota here in time.
Just give them a chance.
Yeah.
It's coming. Okay, so how hard is it for laboratories to meet these detection limits? I mean, geez, parts per quadrillion. I mean,
Yeah.
what are we talking about? I mean, how can you even detect that and be accurately reasonable? Like it's here.
So it's a combination of technology and expertise and processes. So
Okay.
technology wise, the instrumentation we use is a liquid chromatography mass spec, and it's
Okay.
a tandem mass spec. So the acronym we use is LCMSMS. And the manufacturers of those instruments have been able to make instruments with enough sensitivity that we can achieve today's kind of standard, which is about 2 parts per trillion. When we get into the part per quadrillion range, we're really kind of maxing out on the capabilities of those instruments. And so we'll have to incorporate the latest and greatest in instrument technology, which comes at a very hefty price tag.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah, I can only imagine.
which has pretty significant implications on the industry. It's not just a burden for the laboratories to have to spend that money. There's many laboratories that can't afford that kind of expense, and we already have a shortage of capacity in the industry to keep up with the demand for PFAS testing. And
Yeah.
then, oh, and then
Yeah.
on the other side, you've got we've talked about how ubiquitous these chemicals are. They're everywhere and everything. Well, that includes a laboratory environment. And so,
Of course, yeah. How
right?
do you eliminate cross contamination?
Exactly. And so
Right?
even if an instrument is sensitive enough to detect down to parts per quadrillion, your reagents you use, the solvents, the glassware, the every single thing in that laboratory environment has to be clean down to parts per quadrillion. The
Oh my
air
gosh.
that comes through the HVAC system, all of it.
Yeah.
So
Right. It's like you're in a sealed off location, and you're like basically going in for a COVID
yeah, like clean room.
PPE, yeah, clean room just to get in because you can't have any cross contamination. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I used to work in a lab right out of college, and I did metals prep.
Uh-huh.
And so and part of my job was glassware, of course,
Yeah.
and which was the worst job ever.
Yeah,
We were doing the acid bath dipping and oh my
that's right.
gosh.
That's where we all start out.
And I was like, you mean I went to college for 4 years to come out and do glassware prep? I'm out of here. So, anyways, that was a long story, long time ago. But yeah, it was a good experience just to learn the environment of a laboratory and how important it is to keep things clean and
Yeah.
to, there's processes in place to, run these and protocols to run these samples. Well, what type of analytical instruments? You talked a little bit about the analytical instrument. Is there only one type of analytical instrument, or are there others that you can use?
Yeah, so the primary instrument used is the liquid chromatography mass spec. There
Okay.
are other instruments that come into play for more specialized applications.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a liquid chromatography mass spec with a time of flight. So we call those QTOFs, quadruple time of flight mass spec. And those are very highly specialized pieces of equipment. They're predominantly used by EPA and academia for research and development. But we have those instruments and we utilize them for production work as well. They allow us to look for unknowns. So the way
Mm.
a laboratory typically operates is you have to tell the lab exactly which chemicals you want to look for in a sample. We
Mm-hmm.
have to purchase standard reference material of those chemicals, and that's how
Right.
we can identify them in a sample. Well, with PFAS, there are very few standard reference materials available. This is
Mm.
why labs look for such a limited list of PFAS compared to the thousands that have been produced. So, with a QTOF instrument, we can look for unknown PFAS where no standard reference material exists. This is why it's
Oh,
typically used in R&D type of purposes and by the EPA.
gotcha.
But so that's one piece of specialized equipment. There's also something folks are probably far more familiar with, GC, gas
Yep.
chromatography mass spec, used for
Right.
volatiles and semi-volatiles. So we use that to look for the volatile PFAS compounds. The majority of the PFAS that we're looking for today that are regulated, they are semi-volatile compounds, but there are volatile PFAS compounds. So depending on the application and what we're concerned about, we might want to capture those as well. And so we have different instrumentation for that.
Wow. So we'll talk about the protocols, the EPA protocols that are out there. I think there's the one that's the EPA method 537. And what's the purpose of that protocol? I mean, how does that help you detect these compounds?
So, laboratories are typically dependent upon EPA standard methods to inform how we conduct our analyses. For PFAS, we have method 537.1 and method 533. Those are for drinking water only, so
Mm-hmm.
finished potable water. There are no EPA reference methods for any other matrix. So if
Oh,
we
so
want
soil or sludges or air, there's no parameters or
right,
protocols there.
groundwater, wastewater, landfill leachate, you name it, anything other than finished drinking water, there are no EPA established reference methods. So the
Well,
laboratories have had to make up their own methodology.
Yeah. So how does that work? I mean, like for instance, how do you rely on that method, or that's it's not the EPA one, from a defensible perspective, right?
Yeah.
How does that work?
So this is a question that's been plaguing our industry for many years. Many years.
Okay, because you usually you got your solid waste, SWA 46 or something like that, and you use those methods for soil or some other waste, testing and protocols. But here you're telling me we only have two protocols, and it's only for drinking water and for nothing else. And as this thing grows, like because the contaminants of concern and the media of concern are going to grow, there's no methods besides the drinking water. That's a big challenge for EPA.
It is. So what we've been doing to date is laboratories have developed their own methods. We call them user defined methods.
Okay.
And there's no federal regulation. So there wasn't really a challenge or an issue at the federal level. But at the state level, when individual states decided that they wanted to regulate and do something about these chemicals, well, this was one of the early roadblocks they hit. Well, what method do we
Yeah,
require the
you want
analysis
us
to
to
be
get
done
down to
by?
this level, but how we even test for it? There's no method. If you tell us the method, we'll try to get to the level,
No.
right? But they're going, yeah, we need to get back with you on that.
Yeah, so what a number of states defaulted to was kind of the only federal standard out there was
Hmm.
from the Department of Defense. So the DoD doesn't publish methods, but they do publish something called the Quality Systems Manual, and it's just a collection of quality assurance criteria that they say any work being done at a DoD facility has to meet this quality assurance criteria. So we know it's of the most defensible, rigorous type of quality of data. Well, what they do usually do is they reference that SW846 method and they say,
Yeah.
okay, you're going to follow method 8260 for volatiles, but you're also going to do this, 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 and this. And they add up on criteria to make sure it's really defensible. Well,
Okay.
they didn't have that option with PFAS in groundwater or soil or tissues. So they created this table of criteria that's really robust and it reads somewhat like a method. And so what the states did was they said, okay, we want to regulate, we want to address PFAS in wastewater and our groundwater. And so you use your user defined method, whatever you call it, but you have to meet the DoD quality systems criteria. And so
Gotcha.
that way they could have confidence in the defensibility of the data and also that it would be comparable and consistent from one lab to another. So that's been kind of a stopgap measure for the industry.
So obviously, it sounds like there will be additional methods coming down the pike. It's just going to take EPA some time to develop the appropriate protocol for them. And I got to imagine they're probably going to be working with laboratories like you and others, right, to help develop these methods.
So they took their first stab at it, not in collaboration with commercial laboratories. They wrote the method, they validated it using state labs who were able to support that method, and they released it for public comment in 2019. It received a fair bit of criticism during the public comment period for not meeting certain data quality objectives, and it still remains draft today. They haven't published the final document yet. They're supposed to be publishing it this year. When they do, it will be for non-potable water only. But it's kind of been characterized as a rapid screening method.
Gotcha.
So not really filling the need of the industry right now. But in the meantime, they got to work on a second method. And that method, the EPA is collaborating with the Department of Defense on. So it's a joint effort between those agencies. And they're getting ready to do the third party lab validation this year. So that will have input from the commercial lab community. There'll be up to 10 laboratories supporting that validation effort.
Yeah, I'm surprised though they haven't gone, you know, directly to some of the third party professional labs. You guys are running this as a business every single day. You would think they would really tap into your expertise and your knowledge on the best appropriate protocols because everyone's going to be coming to you guys anyways for the actual testing service.
Right. It was certainly a missed opportunity on the first go around, but hopefully, we'll get it right on the second try.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. Well, what types of media is Eurofins testing? I mean, what can you test PFAS in? Like, what type of compound or media can you actually test it in with your own modified versions of your
Yeah.
method?
Uh, I'd say we have yet to meet a matrix that we can't test. So
Okay.
pretty much everything. But in general, as an industry, the country is very focused on drinking water, groundwater, wastewater, landfill leachate, and biosolids. Those make up the bulk of the matrices that we test today. Kind of on the fringe or just starting to emerge is looking at PFAS in sediment, fish tissue, vegetation, air, both ambient air and source air. And then a lot of product testing is starting to happen now because you have a lot of legislation at the state level um, looking to ban any PFAS in consumer products.
Kind of like
And
PCBs
so,
back in the day.
yep, yep. So with a lot of that legislation, there's a lot of requests to start looking at, well, what's in these consumer products.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, I mean, since PFAS is such a ubiquitous, product in the environment, I mean, how important is sampling protocols associated with, obtaining a representative sample? I mean, there's got to be a pretty prescribed process to collect a real good, true, affected sample. How- you know?
Yeah. So kind of like that we were talking about with the laboratory environment earlier, think about having to control the field sampling environment
How can
down
you?
to
Yeah, it's
parts per
almost seems like
trillion.
impossible. Almost. I mean, it does seem like impossible when you think about it in that term, if it's that present in the environment.
Yeah, so okay, we do have real concerns about possible contribution in the field at very low part per trillion levels. But there's also a lot of urban legend out there about what the potential sources of contamination are.
Hmm.
And as an industry right now, we're really trying to tackle undoing some of that. So, what
Okay.
happened was there were these guidance documents that were drafted many years ago with best sampling practices. And they had these tables of acceptable and prohibited items that could be used for sampling or in the field. Um,
Hmm.
and virtually none of it was substantiated with any empirical data.
Hmm.
So it may have been just their best guesses for whatever reason, what they thought was a problem or wasn't a problem. And then that got propagated. So as a state or an agency in one country or another would look to see, well, what has been done, what's out there, they'd find this guidance, this table, and they would
They
just
copied
copy it
it.
into their own. Right. So we
Yeah.
propagated this literally across the globe,
Uh huh.
and now we're trying to undo it. So you've got researchers and folks like ourselves that are challenging. We're asking the question, well, how do we know PFAS is in this product or that product or not in this product or that product? And so now we're starting to do the testing and actually collecting that empirical data. So there were a number of studies published in the last year that start to illuminate some of this for us. Um, I myself am part of a organization, National Groundwater Association, and we
Yeah.
have a committee that's working to draft a new guidance document that starts to dispel some of those urban legends and fill in some of the gaps on where the data is missing.
Yeah. I mean, like, how do you collect a groundwater sample if you can't use, your HTP polytubing to pump it out to get it out? I mean, that's a big concern.
Yeah, because when you look at those prohibited item
That was on
columns,
the list, right?
anything that is PTFE or and that's a lot of the groundwater sampling equipment.
Right. I mean, yeah, you're gonna have to be stainless steel balers.
Yeah.
You're gonna go old school if you do this.
Yeah. But
And then,
studies have shown that not all products that even have PTFE components are leaching or contributing PFAS. So
okay, yeah,
we've got to turn to the data and to really inform our decisions about these. So there's these two dichotomies at play. There's maybe this over conservative approach that's somewhat driven by urban legends, but then there's this very real challenge of part per trillion. Every
Yeah.
little piece adds up pretty quickly to a
Oh.
detection above the reporting limit. So we have to
Oh.
balance the two.
I mean, I think like a whole industry is going to pop up of just, verifying products to be sold aren't containing PFAS for use in everyday life. So, I mean, I could see that just being a industry in itself. And then I got to imagine you're probably going to require everyone to take a background sample of some sort just to verify. And then your trip blanks and everything else is going to be real important.
Yeah, so not everybody can afford to conduct their own product testing for, every one of their applications. So the fallback right now is field quality control sampling. So you take equipment blanks for the equipment you use, field blanks to measure whether there was anything on your person or in your environment that could have contributed, so that you can start to explain if you get any detections above the reporting limit, where they may have come from.
Sure. Right. No, I mean, yeah, it makes sense. But geez, Louise. So, are there sampling guidelines out there right now that industry people can follow? I mean, I know, consultants are working their own little sampling protocols up, but are there other general guidelines for people to say, hey, this is a pretty good template to follow?
Yeah, the state of Michigan created a very thorough tutorial. A lot of the guidance out there has been kind of generic precautions and these lists of the acceptable and prohibited items, but Michigan really tackled step by step guidance and tutorials, and they did
Oh,
it matrix specific. So there's one for groundwater, for soil, for
okay.
biosolids, for tissues. So it's been the industry standard right now. Most folks are looking to the Michigan guidance, but I will say it is one of those guidance that includes a fair amount of the overly
Urban legends.
conservative precautions, some of the urban legends. So,
Okay. Well, good
yeah,
for
we
the
still,
DQ. It's okay. They're leading the way there. That's good. That's good for them.
yeah.
Okay, good. Well, let me see here. I had another question for you. I was trying to think here. All right, where do you see, what do you see going on, in within the country as, I'm sorry, let me see. Yeah. Where do you see we're going in this industry with PFAS in the coming years? I mean, we definitely have a lot of, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of what PFAS going to look like for the regulated community.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that is a big question. Okay, so there's all these different elements that are in play right now. We need to know what the drinking water regulations are going to be, what the hazardous substance designation is going to be. Once those things start to fall into place, then there's a clear path forward for what the next 5 years, 10 years, looks like.
Sure. Yeah.
There's the treatment side of things. So the EPA just released at the end of last year kind of this memorandum on the state of the science for disposal and destruction of PFAS. It was supposed to be a guidance document, but we're just not far enough along for them to make recommendations. All they could really do was catalog what's currently being done and where the gaps are that we need to fill in. So we need to understand the best way to dispose of or preferably destroy these chemicals. So the
Yeah.
next 5 years is heavily focused on destruction technologies. And then the toxicology. So,
Yeah. How
not
bad is it? I mean,
exactly how bad
because
is
if
it
it's
and
not
which
that bad,
ones?
why are we treating down to these levels and requiring these crazy quadrillion, you know,
Yeah.
detection
Yeah.
limits?
And just the cost, because they're
Yeah.
everywhere, what the cost will be to us as a society to clean them all up. We have to make
Yeah.
a really thoughtful evaluation of, yeah, what the impact is.
I mean, okay, let's put this in perspective though. I mean, the PFAS are everywhere, right? I mean, the cost of that could be just
Tr-
devastating for society.
Trillions. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's like almost on the level of climate change. I
Yeah.
mean, it's that big of a, problem that we how do you grapple or how do you wrap your hands around all that, right?
Yeah.
Oh my
Well,
gosh. It's
chemical pollution in general is probably the second biggest thing we're facing next to climate change, whether it's
yeah.
PFAS or it's some other chemical. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. So interesting. Okay. So well, are there any PFAS issues, or are there anything like that's out there flying under the radar associated with PFAS that could be really a major impact that's not really being discussed right now? Something that's kind of like,
Well,
you know,
so I started off saying I got into this business specializing in vapor intrusion. There is the possibility that that's one of those things flying under the radar. If we find out that these pose a vapor intrusion risk,
yeah,
then
that could be like a whole nother assessment level, testing level. I mean, geez, you got to imagine the cost of reopening a site that was closed, and just let's talk about the analytical and investigation costs. I mean, I can't imagine PFAS sampling is cheap, not like
right.
VOCs.
Right. And I mean, we went through that with vapor intrusion, right? It wasn't a pathway of concern. And so all the sites that had been closed out had never looked at that pathway, and states
Mm-hmm.
had to decide whether they were going to go back and reopen sites to look at that pathway. Well, right now, states have to decide if they're going to reopen sites to look for PFAS. And are we just going to look for them in groundwater and soil? Or are we also going to have to look for them in the vapor intrusion pathway? So we're just now starting to study whether these chemicals have the potential to pose a VI risk. So I don't have an answer to that question. But if the answer is yes, I would say
That's a
that
big one.
that would be a curveball.
Mm,
And
mm.
really, if they pose an inhalation risk too, that's something that really hasn't been well characterized. So we know the primary exposure comes through ingestion of the chemicals, but we don't understand what the potential health impacts are from inhalation.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, there's a whole human health exposure scenario challenges. The CIHs and the health safety professionals of the world is going to really have to address that situation or that chemical pathway potentially down the road if it becomes an
Right.
inhalation problem. Wow. Yeah, there's so many facets to this compound, and I'm hoping that there's really, I mean, I know there's probably a lot of really smart people working on this, but to pull this all together, right? To really start chipping away, systematically to understand this is going to be important because it's got such a big impact.
Yeah, and good news is the new administration, the new EPA administrator, this is a top priority for them. And they've already, within the first 100 days, started making changes and putting things in motion. And so I think we have a better shot today than we did before in terms of the collaboration that's going to be necessary and the guidance that's going to be necessary to pull this all together from all of these different aspects. That are each on their own right are so challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of these. You mentioned it earlier about site assessments, phase ones. The ATSM standard.
Hmm.
For all appropriate inquiries. I mean, they're going to have to write that into the assessment to validate and verify that that's not a wreck.
Yep,
You know,
exactly.
and that's going to cause a whole litany of potential litigation. Oh my gosh, and site cleanup requirements is that's going to be a big deal, obviously,
Oh my
and I'm
gosh, we
sure.
didn't even touch on litigation today. I mean, that whole world has been turned upside down.
Oh
I've never
yeah,
seen so many lawsuits around one chemical. Oh my
and
gosh,
there's
it's
not
just
any laws
mind-boggling.
about it in the books yet right now either, right? So there's just a lot of oh wow.
Yeah,
I'd hate to be on the ends of on either side of those
right.
suits and conversations. Well, do you envision at some point in the future that there may be field methods to test and characterize PFAS in the field? Like a screening method of some sort, or like you can test for metals in the field and for screening, and
Right.
or field any field application for this?
So today, the limitation with a field application has been sensitivity. With regulations in the low part per trillion range, field instruments are typically not capable of achieving those levels. So you could maybe get a field estimate at a part per billion, but how useful is that to you? So that's been the limitation so far. Do I think we'll get there? I do, because there's so much activity around PFAS. It's become its own industry right now. So where there's money, there people will develop technologies. So I'm sure we'll get there, but we're just not there yet, and that's been the limiting factor is sensitivity.
Yeah, I got to imagine the company comes up first with that silver bullet is going to do
Mhm.
pretty well.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, now some of the media that's being used to treat, on site, maybe, pump and treat or water filtration type, I mean, we're talking, what are we talking about? More like carbon and some other destructive type chemicals to be used to treat, to destroy?
Right. So primary treatment so far has been GAC, the granulated activated carbon, and the ion exchange resins. But that's just sequestering,
Yeah, it's
and so
not
it's not
they still got to get
destroying.
rid of, they still got to get rid of the GAC then at that point, right? And at
Right.
that point, I guess they're going through incineration or landfill
Exactly.
disposal. I mean, they could do disposal, but I think there's going to be a pushback from the landfill operators because they don't want to junk up their leachate.
There's a big pushback across the country now with landfills and their resistance to accept PFAS impacted waste.
I mean, if they know it's coming, it's not a good idea to take it
Mhm.
just because of the uncertainty, right? I mean,
Yeah, and I mean it's like it's very facility specific at this stage what they will or will not accept.
yeah. I've been on the conversations and receiving end of some of those with various disposal firms who like, hey, yeah, we'll take it at this location, but we won't at this one. Um,
Exactly.
so it's just, and then I think the incinerators and the business are really gonna do well
Yeah,
to
so we
help the
were
industry.
we were incinerating PFAS waste a little bit indiscriminately for the past several
Mhm.
years, and now we're starting to tighten up on that. And there's been some legislation passed that addresses that, and so we have to really start monitoring and measuring what's being emitted from these incinerators. Are we truly getting 100% destruction
Destruction.
of these chemicals, or are we just breaking them into other chemicals? And do we know what other chemicals they're breaking into? And are those more or less harmful? And so, big focus area for the EPA and their research right now is to understand that.
So yeah, so I'm sure there's a lot of that type of studying going on and evaluation of air emissions from incinerators. And it's a good question. And as they do bioaccumulate over time, I mean, that's going to be a concern for those guys too.
Yeah.
Wow, lots of interesting, you know, issues to really talk about. I mean, we could probably go on for another hour of just getting into some of the specific
Please.
details easily because I mean I'm not an expert in this space, but I do know quite a few things about the PFAS, especially around the disposal framework of it and some of the analytical testing side. I'm not a chemist by any means, but I am a biology major and I did work in a lab, so I got a little experience there. But you know what? It's interesting to see these types of chemicals come up in a person's career because you know when I started out, the PCBs had just been banned for a while, and then people were starting to get used to not having them around. But then they're still around because they're still being used as a good fire retardant for a lot of things. And well, now PFAS is the next big one.
I
Um,
know. And
wow.
and unfortunately for a lot of folks, you cannot avoid the chemistry. If you're dealing with PFAS, you have to understand the chemistry at play here. It is an integral piece of the puzzle. And, a lot of folks, they don't want to hear about the chemistry. The chemistry is your
Yeah.
problem. You know about it. You deal with it. I'll do my part. But no, everybody's got to kind of roll their sleeves up and dive
Go
in.
back to chemistry class,
Yeah,
get an
yeah,
organic and figure this out. No, these are fluorine bonds and not the,
yes.
normal chlorinated bonds. And, right. So, yeah, I think there's an education piece here that I think will continue to evolve over the next, few years because you're going to constantly be in this educational mode, right?
Yeah.
Which is why you're a practice leader at Eurofins.
Yeah, that's right. I will have job security for a while, I'm sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Taryn, this has been a great episode. I mean, this has been just very enlightening. I'm sure Eurofins is going to be leading the way in the industry, at least one of the leaders in the industry. I mean, there's other, quality labs out there as well.
Certainly.
But I think you guys are doing a great job. Is there any last little parting words of wisdom that you'd like to share with the listeners before we, let you go?
I mean, we really are learning more every day. So I just encourage, if you bothered to tune into this podcast, you're on the right track. Just keep tuning in, listening to the research that's being done and staying abreast of all the developments because it's changing right from under our feet. What we understand about these chemicals and what our concerns are about them, how to address them. So, keep tuning in.
Well, and I do know you've done a couple recent, seminars on PFAS. So people need to check that out too.
Sure, sure. Yeah, if you go to our Eurofins website, you can see a list of all the webinar topics. We do a whole series on PFAS because there's so many different aspects to address. So we try to break it down and really dive in deep to some of the details.
Well, that's good. So, listeners, make sure you check out Taryn and go to the Eurofins website to pick up some more information. And obviously, we'll be providing more information along the way in this journey of the PFAS regulatory and just more awareness process of understanding in the industry this whole topic because it's going to be a lot to cover over the coming years. And I'm really glad you came on the show today, Taryn. Thanks for being our guest. And we look forward to getting this episode out in the coming days. And feel free to reach out and share with your social media outlets. Okay.
Great. Thanks. It was a pleasure.
All right. We really appreciate you coming on.
Bye.